And friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 6, verses 30 through 34, and verses 53 through 56. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Well, it's really easy for us to just maintain the status quo. Now, I know that COVID certainly caused a lot of disruption in our lives, and we had to adapt. But when things aren't forcing us to adapt, we're often content to continue in the patterns, in the ways that we normally have. But there are some big events that are known for knocking us off our axis, that are known for making us move. And they're often referred to in different professions as the 4 Ds. Now, there are some slight variations on the way these Ds are interpreted. But the 4 Ds are generally presented as this: death, as in the death of someone dear to you; disease, whether it's yourself or someone you care about deeply receiving that diagnosis that we dread; divorce, which is certainly something which disrupts our family life; and disaster. Now, disaster is a strong word. I've also heard it as disruption, but it can be anything from the loss of a job to failing business to just being forced to relocate to a different city. For any of those things, these can just knock us out of our routine and force us into having to adapt. And when these things happen, they can actually send us to therapy, for instance, to learn to adjust and adapt to our circumstances. It can send us to a financial planner who can help us try and gain or regain financial stability that we may have lost. And it's also one of the big drivers in sending people to church. Now, I know that a lot of you have simply attended church since you were younger, and you don't really remember a time when you didn't attend church. But for those who, stopped attending for a while, which certainly happens, it's certainly quite normal these days, often the impetus to return, the impetus to feel a need to reconnect with faith is one of those 4 Ds. Now, that's actually the basis of the story that we have today. The story that we have is that crowds are seeking Jesus out. And in fact, they're looking at the disciples, they're recognizing them, and they're kind of guessing where they're headed. And it says they hurried there on foot. See, Jesus took a boat to cross, but they're going around on land, and they hurried so much that they arrived ahead of them. They're guessing where Jesus is going with his disciples, and they get there first. Now, why are they getting there? They're getting there because they're bringing their sick on mats. You see, one of those 4 Ds has hit them. And someone they care about deeply is sick, and they are willing to go anywhere, do whatever it takes in order to find healing for the person they care about. Now, these days we certainly understand that impulse, but at least for the most part today, we don't have the burden of what they had back then, which was a prevailing belief that the sick often deserved what happened to them. Many people in that time blamed the sick for getting sick. They believed that it was a curse. They believed that it was the result of sin. They believed that somehow they had offended one of the gods. Whatever it was, they believed that in some way the person was responsible for what befell them. And in a situation like that, in a society like that, right, not only are you concerned for your loved one, but you're not getting much compassion. But that's not how Jesus sees the situation. It says that Jesus looks out at the crowd, and what he has is compassion. You see, he's not filled with blame, he's filled with empathy. And he looks at them, and what he sees is people in need. And he says that they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, sometimes when we hear that term shepherd, we think in terms of leadership, right? Making the flock go where the flock needs to go. But in the Bible, when it talks about shepherds and when Jesus talks about being a good shepherd, the first and foremost quality of the shepherd is that the shepherd cares about the sheep. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, that he would lay down his life for the sheep. Jesus describes a good shepherd as one who notices that 1 out of 100 sheep is missing and goes off in search of it because not even one sheep is allowed to be lost. Jesus understands that the most important duty of a shepherd is to care for the sheep, and what he sees is people who feel that no one cares for them. And it is because of the caring that they seek out Jesus. They bring their sick. They do what it takes in order to go find this, because it's a fundamental thing that we need someone who cares. Caring is where help starts. When we seek out a person to help us through, if we've suffered one of the 4 Ds or whatever it is, and we seek out someone to help us, the first thing we want to know is that they care. And one of the ways in which that caring is expressed is that they don't blame you for being in the circumstance that you're in. Right? I don't know if you've ever gone to a person for help in that kind of circumstance, but they don't generally approach it, right, as blame. They approach it as, okay, here's where we are. Let's look at the situation. And now let's look to see how to move forward. They want to help you move forward, and they're giving you the hope of knowing that there is a way to move forward. And that is such a powerful thing that we will go to great lengths to find people who care, who give us hope, and who show us a way to move forward. It's so powerful that I want to ask you a pretty direct question, and that's to ask you, are you that kind of presence in the lives of others? Are you a healing presence? Are you a person who shows others that you care? Who transmits hope? Who tries to show people a way forward? No blame, no judgment, just caring and hope and possibility. That's such an important thing for us to be in the lives of others. But when we choose not to be, then not only are we not a healing presence, but it's very difficult not to be either a healer or one who wounds. So a difficult self-reflection can be, where have I wounded others? Because wounding others doesn't necessarily have to be active, right? It doesn't necessarily have to involve being directly antagonistic toward others, but rather just being dismissive, suggesting that it is their fault, or simply not caring can be very wounding. And you know this because you and I have all been on the receiving end of that. that when we need someone to care, we get blown off. And that hurts. And what happens in that moment is that you feel less. You just feel like you're less. Do we ever do that to others? Do we ever make them somehow feel like they're less? See, one of the things that it stands out so much about Jesus' encounters with people is that even if they were sinners, even, whatever they were when they came up to Jesus, he never made them feel like less. Such a wonderful quality to aspire to. To be someone where after an encounter with you, they never feel like less. And when we think about that, when we think about who we encounter, do we only think about the people who are close to us? Do we only think about our friends or maybe our co-workers and not think more broadly? Because one of the things in this story that I think is really interesting is the way they describe healing going to the people. Which is, they say that people, begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. See, they didn't need to even see Jesus face to face. They didn't need Jesus to pronounce healing on them or touch them. They just needed to touch the fringe of his cloak and they got healing. Jesus healed at the fringes of his encounters. And so I wonder, how are you at the fringes of your daily life? How do you deal with people where you may not even know their names? Do they come away feeling uncared for, anonymous, maybe even less? Or do you work to be a healing presence out to the fringes of your life? It's often said that a society is judged by the way they treat the least among them. And it's a great rubric to follow, because one thing we know is that if you treat the least among you well, no one else is being treated worse. Everyone is treated well. If you expand your healing presence to the fringes of your encounters, you will also be treating well the people who are at your core. What if we judged ourselves by the way we treat the people at the fringes of our lives? Are you a healing presence in all of your encounters, and not just the people who you hold nearest and dearest to yourself? And there's one last relationship where we're often not as kind as we ought to be. And that's the relationship we have with ourselves. See, the story began with Jesus talking to his disciples who had just been on a tremendous healing mission. This is right after where Jesus had sent them out to towns, and they had gone and done amazing things. And then he says, come to a deserted place, all by yourselves, and rest a while. They had done so much healing. They'd kind of forgotten to take care of themselves. And I wonder how many of us have done the same. How many of us have forgotten to be a healing presence in our own lives? How many of us are a healing presence to others, but when it comes to ourselves, we wound ourselves? When it comes to ourselves, sometimes we even make ourselves feel like less. So I want to encourage you to make sure that you also find your own sources of healing. If you're going to love your neighbor as yourself, then you need to love yourself. And one of the ways in which you do is to say to yourself the things that you long to hear from others. You know that sometimes when you see a person treat someone else badly, when you hear a person, be mean or rude, one of the things that we come to understand is that they probably had that happen to them. Sometimes we're as nasty or not nice or unkind to others as others have been to us. So sometimes when we take our lives, look at our lives and use that to inform the way we treat others, are we willing to say to others what we long to hear for ourselves? Or will we instead say to others the worst of what was said to us? It's a choice that we make. And when we choose to say to ourselves the things we long to hear, when we choose to be a healing presence in our own lives, then as healed people, we can be a healing presence to others, even out to the fringes of our encounters with them. But this is something that we can only do if we're willing to be conscious of it, if we're willing to reflect on it, if we're willing to ask ourselves, am I a healing presence to me? Am I a healing presence to the people around me? And am I a healing presence to the people out to the fringes of my encounters? Do people come away feeling like they're cared for? Like there's hope? Like they aren't being blamed or judged? Or do they come away feeling less? Choose the path of healing. And choose it for you. And choose it for the world. Because it's one of the most powerful impulses that people seek. They will go as far as they need to find it, and they'll treasure where they find it from. Amen.